I'd like to now yield to Mr. Lung for such time as he may consume.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, honorable members of Congress, and thank you, my colleagues. I begin with a quote credited to both John Bunyan and later to Mahatma Gandhi. "It is better in prayer to have a heart without words than words without heart." I pray you all hear my heart in these words as I speak my truth. In the 1970s, a man took a boy to whom he was related to a cabin in a rural part of the country. The man told the boy to undress and to wait. The boy obeyed him. Moments later, another boy entered the room accompanied by two men. The first boy, upon seeing how scared the second boy looked, asked, "What's the matter? Why are you so scared?" The second boy replied in shock and in disbelief, "You don't know. You don't know." The man took the second boy into an adjoining room, and the two men proceeded to violently rape the boy. I am the first boy. And that was the first time I was trafficked. I was trafficked for 4 years. I survived physical abuse, sexual abuse, mental and emotional abuse, sex trafficking, and torture over more than 13 years of my childhood. And I managed to graduate high school. And I managed to graduate college. And I managed to graduate law school. And in my courtroom, they all rise when I come in, and they call me judge. But now, know this. There are no survivors who stand alone in their recovery. Survivors need help. They need food and shelter. They need an education. They need counseling and recovery services. They need good and fair employment. They need peer support. They need the very provisions of the TVPA. The survivors of today need this bill. And they need you. And they need you too. And they need you too. And they need you to support this bill and to carry this bill forward. I will undoubtedly receive criticism from my fellow survivors for saying that they need you, because survivors are a proud people, and they fiercely fight for themselves in whatever way they can to survive. But no survivor stands alone. I didn't get here alone. I had my mother, a strong woman of faith, who taught me to believe in hope. I had my grandmother, who taught me about courage. I had my brother, who taught me to trust again. I had a flock of therapists, including Dee Marcotte and Jennifer Sandberg of Colorado, who taught me that vulnerability is not weakness. Vulnerability is unimaginable strength. I have had amazing friends, Pat, Mark, Ed, Dave, Bill, Dan, Paul, Lon, Alessandra, Tina, Nathan, Russell, Anna, Bukola, Suleiman, Bella, and so many others who stood by me in my lowest of lows, the greatest of which, my wife of 19 years and my best friend, Shireen Chase. And all along, I've had my God, who loves me, who forgives me, and who guides me to this very day, to this very moment. The bill before you contains provisions that can provide the resources and pathways for children, for youth, for young persons, for adults to find their own pathways to their own goals, whether those goals are to graduate high school, or to own their own company, or to be an advocate, or to be a parent, or to be a mentor, or a lawyer, or a judge, or a congressperson, or a United States ambassador. With the aid you have the power to provide, their futures are limitless. The victims of trafficking need these protections and these provisions, so they too may transition from victim to survivor to thriver. They need you. We need you. And I need you. I need you to look at our faces, the faces of these survivors, not as if we are strangers with no connection to you. I need you to imagine instead that seated here are your sons and your daughters, your children, needing this help. I need you to imagine saying yes that you will help a victim become so much more than what happened to them. I shared with you that I was the first boy and what happened to me that day and the years thereafter. Support this bill, adopt this bill, follow Congressman Smith's path to provide for survivors so that one day there can be the last girl, the last boy, the last child to come before Congress begging for your help. Every single one of you took this job for the exact same reason: to help others, to make a difference. The most noble of employees. And in the mix and mess of your daily duties, you start to lose sight of your first purpose, your true calling. Now, I know no one will remember me. No one's going to remember this 5-minute speech. But I beg you to remember the story of the first boy, because history will remember you. History will remember if you made a difference, if you joined in support of the TVPA. Here is your chance to re-embrace your true purpose, to make a difference. Make this difference. Support this bill. This is the way back to your true purpose, to help others and to make a difference. This is your way. I leave you with one more quote from someone else history will never forget, St. Ignatius Loyola. Work as if everything depends on you. Pray as if everything depends on God. May you be blessed in all of your work in these sacred halls for the greater good of all. I thank you. May you be blessed.
Judge Lung, thank you for that excellent testimony. Your experience absolutely encourages all of us to do far more than we've done. And again, for helping us write this bill, which is almost ready for introduction. And you helped us last year when we did the Frederick Douglass, which did pass the House, didn't get out of the Senate. But I want to thank you for the input that you provided. It's extraordinary.
Thank you, sir.
Without our survivors and survivor-informed, trauma-informed, we would Vandenberg.
Good morning. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Wild, and members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to testify before you today. My name is Martina Vandenberg, and I'm president of the Human Trafficking Legal Center. I also just want to say that it's an honor today to testify alongside Bella, Gina, and Robert. Thank you all for your leadership. We couldn't do any of this without you. Before I begin, I just want to thank you, Congressman Smith. I have appeared before you over your last 25 years of leadership on human trafficking, testifying before you on multiple occasions to discuss peacekeeping and human trafficking by government contractors, trafficking of domestic workers by diplomats, and forced labor in global supply chains. I am particularly grateful to you for your attention to forced labor, which is an egregious violation of human rights. We've gathered together today to discuss the implementation of the TVPA. And so I want to begin this morning with the successes. The first success is accountability. The TVPA has proven to be a powerful tool to hold traffickers and perpetrators of forced labor accountable. The statute covers extraterritorial jurisdiction, an essential provision to combat forced labor in global supply chains. Number two, access to justice for survivors. In 2003, Congress created a private right of action under the TVPA. That law permits victims to hold their traffickers accountable in the federal courts. The extraterritorial jurisdiction provisions of the statute have allowed trafficking survivors to bring successful civil cases even where the forced labor occurred abroad. In two important cases litigated in the Eastern District of Virginia, litigated by pro bono lawyers, I should add, Roe versus Howard and Doe versus Howard, federal courts awarded damages to domestic workers trafficked into sexual servitude and forced labor by a U.S. diplomat. The trafficking occurred in Japan and Yemen. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the jury verdict in Roe versus Howard, a decision that reflected Congress's intent to provide trafficking victims with extraterritorial jurisdiction to hold their traffickers accountable. Number three, the success of the TIP report. The Trafficking in Persons report has evolved into a powerful foreign policy tool, although I do agree with you, Congressman Smith, absolutely about the grading issues. The country rankings matter a great deal, and being rigorous and honest with those country rankings is absolutely essential. Number 4, a big success of the TVPA is evident here today on this panel and its survivor leadership. One need only look at the remarkable and powerful witnesses on this panel to recognize the fundamental role that experts with lived experience play in the formulation of U.S. policy. Trafficking survivors have an immense amount to teach us. They know what is working. They know what is failing. They know how it can be fixed, and they should be in roles of authority to fix it. Finally, a big success that's already been mentioned, the 3 Ps. The TVPA's famous 3 Ps, prevention, protection, and prosecution. Over the last 2 decades, we have focused, myopically, I fear, on prosecution. We are beginning to see more focus on the most neglected P, as Becky also called it, prevention. To prevent human trafficking, we must focus on root causes. Again, I agree completely here with Becky. We must focus on root causes. Violations of workers' rights, violations of the freedom of association, discrimination, lack of enforcement of labor law, and poverty. And as we have seen today, also broken immigration systems. But still, despite this progress over 20 years, which is remarkable and enviable, there are still enormous challenges. One problem that we see here in the United States is with diplomats. Diplomats and international organization personnel are permitted to bring domestic workers into the United States on special visas, known as A3 and G5 visas. And some of these domestic workers are held in forced labor. The Department of State now administers an in-person program to interview each A3 and G5 domestic worker annually. These official check-in interviews play an essential role in preventing human trafficking, catching it before it can become so egregious. These interviews also have placed diplomats on notice that the State Department is watching and will take action. Moreover, the in-person registration interviews can provide the only opportunity for a domestic worker held in forced labor to escape her traffickers, and we have seen this happen. We have advocated to make these in-person registration program requirements statutory, and we urge Congress to pass this mandate in the new TVPA. But what about the domestic workers for whom trafficking wasn't prevented, those who were held in forced labor, those who suffered human trafficking in the United States? Those workers, those trafficking survivors still confront total impunity. Take the case of Malawi. In 2016, a federal court in Maryland ordered a diplomat from Malawi, Jane Kambalame, to pay $1.1 million in damages for trafficking a domestic worker into forced labor in the United States. That domestic worker is here today. Her name is Finus Lepenga. Finus Lepenga is my colleague at the Human Trafficking Legal Center. She is also a member of the U.S. Advisory Council. That diplomat, Jane Kambalame, was allowed to return to Malawi, where she was promoted. She became an ambassador to 2 other African countries on behalf of the government of Malawi. 7 years later, that $1.1 million judgment is still outstanding. Other countries have made what are called ex gratia payments, payments directly to survivors to cover the crimes of their diplomats, because this is a prime example of corruption. When state officials engage in human trafficking, that is corruption. It is clear that additional consequences are necessary for diplomats and their sending states who choose to thwart federal court orders. This makes a mockery of the rule of law, and diplomats who engage in human trafficking should face sanctions. I'd like to turn now to migrant workers held in forced labor in other sectors. What we have learned in our 25 years of working on trafficking and working on the TVPA is that forced labor is a feature and not a bug in global supply chains. We now know that we will not prosecute our way out of forced labor or human trafficking. In 2021, according to the State Department's Trafficking in Persons report, there were just 1,379 prosecutions for forced labor in the world, in the entire world. We still need criminal prosecutions. I'm not saying avoid that P entirely, but we absolutely now must pivot to prevention and focus on workers' rights. Speaking of workers' rights, I want to raise the alarm bell because we are seeing a very troubling trend here in the United States. Professional workers brought to the U.S. with contracts that include steep financial penalties that are euphemistically called liquidated damages. We call these provisions abscondment clauses. The provisions are ubiquitous in contracts for nurses, particularly nurses coming from the Philippines. The contracts preclude the nurses or any worker from leaving their position for 3 years. And if that individual does try to quit their job, the employer or recruiter enforces the liquidated damages clause in state courts. There are many of these cases in state courts that are pending even as we speak this morning. The penalties range from $30,000 to $150,000, trapping these workers in debt bondage. And in New York, 10 nurses who left their jobs and their lawyer faced criminal prosecution for so-called abandonment of their patients. It took years to clear up those charges, to get those indictments off the book. But you cannot turn around those arrests. You cannot turn around that harm. Finally, a state appellate court in New York determined that those prosecutions violated the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Nursing shortages in the United States should not give rise to human trafficking. Nursing shortages in the United States should not give rise to abusive conditions for foreign nurses. Nursing shortages should not give rise to what we consider an American kafala system. Contracts with abscondment fees, no matter the euphemism used to mask the abuse, must end. These contracts are unconscionable, and they should also be unenforceable. I'd like to end today with some concrete recommendations. First, I echo Becky. Increase appropriations to focus on the forgotten P, prevention. That means increasing funding for the Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Affairs, ILAB. That also means that the State Department TIP office funding and USAID funding should shift to focus on workers' rights, freedom of association, prevention of forced labor, and prevention of all forms of human trafficking. Second, focus on corporate accountability. All of us have seen the series in the New York Times about children exploited on the night shift in slaughterhouses in the United States. It's 2023. This is appalling. Corporations should face prosecution, administrative fines, and debarment from U.S. government contracting if they are found to have held workers, if they are found to have held children in forced labor, or if they have benefited from that forced labor. Hold diplomats and their sending states accountable for trafficking of A3 and G5 domestic workers. We have requested sanctions in the Kambalama case. Mandate in-person registration interviews with domestic workers on A3, G5 visas to prevent trafficking by diplomats and to allow them an opportunity to escape. Finally, prohibit the use of contracts with penalty, abscondment fees for nurses and for all migrant workers in the United States. These tools are used to traffic in our country. I'd like to end with a quote from my colleague, Finus Lepenga, who has said for many years, "Nothing about us without us." And that is why it is so important that you are working directly with survivors to write this legislation. Thank you for this opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Ms. Vandenberg, thank you so very much. And you have